courtroom was still, thick with tension as Judge Theodore Grayson leaned back in his chair, a smug smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. His voice, dripping with condescension, echoed through the room. "Miss Carter, do you even realize where you are?" he asked, his tone more mocking than inquisitive. All eyes turned to the girl standing alone at the defendant's table, a teenager, barely 16, her messy curls framing a determined face. She wore a simple hoodie and jeans, her sneakers letting out the faintest squeak as she shifted uncomfortably on the polished floor. Laughter rippled through the courtroom, attorneys exchanging amused glances at the absurdity of the moment. A child, standing before a judge, gripping a stack of papers almost too heavy for her small frame. Amelia Carter's cheeks burned red, but her gaze remained locked on the judge. "Your Honor," she started, her voice calm despite the ridicule. Judge Grayson didn't let her finish. With a dismissive wave of his hand, he cut her off. "Save it. This court doesn't have time for juvenile antics. Frankly, I don't even know why this nonsense was allowed in the first place." A flicker of something unreadable passed over Amelia's face, but she stood her ground. "If you'd let me speak, Your Honor, you might find it worth your time." The courtroom fell silent. A teenager talking back to a judge? Unheard of. Gasps rippled through the spectators. Judge Grayson leaned forward, his smirk deepening into something darker. "Well then," he said, his voice practically oozing mockery, "by all means, enlighten us." Amelia took a breath, steadied herself, adjusted the papers in her hands. And then, she began. What happened next left the entire courtroom in stunned silence. She spoke with precision, confidence, and an undeniable mastery of the law. Citing legal precedents, constitutional clauses, and courtroom procedures with ease, she tore apart the prosecution's arguments one by one. The attorneys who had been chuckling moments before were now frantically scribbling notes, their amusement replaced by something far closer to panic. Judge Grayson's smirk faded, replaced by something rare, disbelief. "Who are you?" he finally asked, his voice no longer mocking but genuinely baffled. Amelia met his gaze, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile. "I'm Amelia Carter," she said, "and I'm here to defend my client." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, frantic whispers flew from every corner. The judge banged his gavel, demanding order, but it was clear he himself was rattled. How was this possible? A teenage girl standing before the court, holding the room captive with nothing but the strength of her knowledge and sheer willpower? And then, for the first time, Amelia's confident smile wavered. A flicker of hesitation crossed her face. What was she about to reveal? 2 weeks earlier, in a small bedroom, Amelia sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by stacks of law books and scribbled legal notes. They weren't hers. They belonged to her older brother, James, who had been preparing to take the bar exam. But James wasn't here anymore. And Amelia had made it her mission to learn everything he once knew. Her best friend, Lily, had watched in disbelief as Amelia buried herself in textbooks, reading late into the night, her fingers covered in ink from endless notes. "What are you even doing?" Lily had asked one afternoon, lying on Amelia's bed, popping a chip into her mouth. "You're, like, 16. You're not a lawyer." Amelia's pen paused. She glanced up, her expression unreadable. "I don't care what people think. I have to do this." Lily sat up, her voice softer now. "But why? Why can't you just let it go?" For a long moment, Amelia didn't answer. She ran a hand over the cover of one of James's old textbooks, her brow furrowed. Finally, she spoke. "Because someone has to stand up for the people who can't stand up for themselves. And James believed I could do it." Lily didn't argue after that. She just watched as her best friend poured herself into something that seemed impossible. But what Amelia hadn't told her, what she hadn't told anyone, was that this wasn't just about justice. It was about proving something. After James's death, everyone had treated her like she was fragile. Like she might break at any moment. Her teachers, her neighbors, even her own parents. They tiptoed around her, speaking in hushed tones, avoiding difficult conversations. But Amelia wasn't fragile. She wasn't a child. She was smart. She was determined. And she was going to prove it to everyone. Back in the courtroom, Amelia's composure had returned, but the atmosphere was tense. Judge Grayson studied her, still visibly unsettled. "Miss Carter," he said slowly, "are you seriously telling me you're representing the defendant?" She nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge narrowed his eyes. "And where, exactly, did you study law?" "I didn't go to law school, if that's what you're asking," Amelia replied, her voice steady. "But I've spent the last year studying legal texts and courtroom procedures. I've read every case relevant to this matter. And I believe I'm qualified to defend my client." The judge let out a sharp breath. "You believe you're qualified? That's not how this works." Amelia didn't flinch. "Then let me prove it." The room held its breath. For a moment, Judge Grayson said nothing. Then, just as he opened his mouth to respond, the doors at the back of the courtroom slammed open. A tall man in a crisp suit strode inside, his deep voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Your Honor," he said, his eyes locked on Amelia, "I believe we have a situation." The tension in the courtroom thickened as the heavy wooden doors creaked open. A tall man strode in, his presence commanding immediate attention. His sharp gray suit, perfectly polished shoes, and confident stride made him stand out starkly against the chaos unfolding in the room. Amelia turned, her confidence faltering for the first time. Who was this man? What did he want? The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, speculation buzzing through the crowd. Judge Grayson, regaining his composure, cleared his throat. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his tone authoritative. "Who are you, and what business do you have interrupting my courtroom?" The man stopped just before the judge's bench, placing his briefcase on the table with practiced ease. He met Judge Grayson's gaze with a respectful nod. "My apologies, Your Honor. My name is Daniel Hayes, and I'm here as a representative of the Bar Association." A ripple of surprise spread through the room. The Bar Association? Amelia's pulse quickened. Was this about her? Her grip tightened around the stack of papers in her hands. Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow. The Bar Association? What interest do they have in this case? Mr. Hayes calmly opened his briefcase, flipping through a folder before speaking. "It's not the case itself that concerns us, Your Honor. It's the matter of representation." He cast a brief glance at Amelia before continuing. "We received an anonymous tip about an unlicensed individual attempting to represent a client in court. Naturally, this is a matter we take very seriously." A heavy silence fell over the room. Amelia's stomach dropped. She had worked tirelessly for this moment. She had pored over legal textbooks, studied case law, practiced arguments in front of a mirror, and now it felt like everything was crumbling before her eyes. Judge Grayson leaned back in his chair, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Well, Mr. Hayes, I'm sure you can see why this is highly irregular. As I was just saying, Miss Carter has no formal legal training. Her presence here is questionable at best." Before Mr. Hayes could respond, Amelia stepped forward. "Your Honor," she said, her voice firm despite the slight tremor in her hands. "I understand this is unusual, but I've done the research. I've prepared for this case as thoroughly as any attorney would. My client deserves a fair defense." Judge Grayson chuckled under his breath. "Miss Carter, this is a court of law, not a stage for theatrics. Do you even understand the seriousness of what you're attempting?" Amelia's eyes burned with determination. "I do. And I also understand that if my client doesn't have someone fighting for them, their entire life could be ruined." A murmur of agreement rippled through the courtroom. Even some of the attorneys, who had scoffed at her earlier, were now looking at her with something that resembled respect. Judge Grayson's smirk faded slightly. He didn't like how the tone in the courtroom was shifting. Mr. Hayes cleared his throat. Your Honor, while I agree that the situation is unconventional, I believe it's only fair to hear Miss Carter out. After all, the law is meant to ensure justice, not suppress it. Judge Grayson scowled, glancing between Mr. Hayes and Amelia, clearly weighing his options. Finally, with an exasperated sigh, he leaned forward. Fine, he said. Miss Carter, I'll allow you to continue, temporarily. But if I find that you're wasting this court's time, I will hold you in contempt. Do I make myself clear? Relief washed over Amelia, but she kept her expression composed. Yes, Your Honor. She took a deep breath and steadied herself. Because this was her moment. Amelia Carter hadn't always been this fearless. A year ago, she was just a regular teenager, more concerned with hanging out with her friends than fighting legal battles. But everything changed the day her brother, James, was arrested. James had been Amelia's hero, brilliant, kind, and fiercely protective. He was only 2 months away from finishing law school when he got into a confrontation outside a bar with a wealthy businessman. The man claimed James had assaulted him. James insisted it was self-defense. But none of that mattered. Despite his innocence, James was arrested and charged. Amelia's parents tried to fight for him, but they didn't have the resources to afford a top-tier lawyer. The public defender assigned to his case was overworked, disinterested, barely putting up a fight in court. And in the end, James was convicted. 3 years in prison. Amelia had been devastated. She watched her brother, a man who had dedicated his life to justice, become a victim of the very system he had believed in. But instead of breaking her, it hardened her. She made a decision. If no one else would fight, she would. She would learn the law. She would study every loophole, every clause, every legal precedent. She would find a way to make things right. Back in the courtroom, Amelia's determination burned brighter than ever. She straightened her shoulders, took a steadying breath, and launched into her argument. Her voice was unwavering. Her words precise. Every statement backed with facts, legal precedents, and irrefutable evidence. Her client, Mr. Peterson, a middle-aged man accused of embezzlement, sat beside her, looking both hopeful and terrified. He had been accused of stealing funds from his employer, but Amelia wasn't convinced. She presented documents that showed discrepancies in the company's financial records. She argued that there was reason to believe someone else could have been responsible. She didn't just argue. She proved. She quoted cases that supported her client's right to a thorough defense. She pointed out inconsistencies in the prosecution's claims. She painted a picture so clear, so compelling, that the entire courtroom sat in stunned silence. Even Judge Grayson, who had mocked her just minutes ago, was now leaning forward, listening intently. And then, something unexpected happened. For the first time since walking into the courtroom, Judge Grayson hesitated. Something in Amelia's words had struck a nerve. He turned to the prosecution. "Do you have a rebuttal?" The prosecuting attorney, who had been so confident before, fumbled with his papers. His voice lacked the certainty it had carried at the start of the trial. Judge Grayson let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple. He looked at Amelia again, this time without the usual condescension. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice measured, "I'll admit, you've made some compelling arguments." The room held its breath. And then, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A new figure stepped inside. And the moment Amelia saw who it was, her entire world changed. The courtroom was locked in silence, every ear straining to catch Amelia's words. Even Judge Grayson, who had spent the entire trial trying to break her confidence, was now leaning forward, his expression unreadable. For the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could do this. But then, Mr. Hayes stood. His presence alone seemed to shift the air, his voice calm but firm. "Your Honor," he said, "while Miss Carter's argument is undeniably impressive, it doesn't change the fact that she is not a licensed attorney. Allowing her to continue sets a dangerous precedent. A fresh wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. The tension in the room thickened, all eyes shifting back to Judge Grayson. The judge exhaled slowly, his gaze locking onto Amelia. His smirk had vanished, replaced with something far more dangerous, cold authority. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice hard, "I'll give you one last chance to explain yourself. Who gave you the authority to act as legal counsel in this case?" Amelia's breath caught. She had prepared for this question, rehearsed for it, but now that it was here, her confidence wavered. She opened her mouth to respond, but the door to the courtroom suddenly creaked open. All heads turned. It wasn't a suited professional who stepped inside. It was a child. A young boy, no older than 10. "Amelia," the boy called out, his small voice breaking through the tense silence. Amelia's breath hitched. Her eyes widened. "Ethan," she whispered. The boy ran toward her, clutching something in his hands, a crumpled envelope. "You forgot this," he said, his little chest heaving as he thrust it toward her. Amelia froze. Her heart pounded in her chest. She recognized the envelope instantly. It was something she had sworn never to reveal. Not here. Not in front of them. But now, with the entire courtroom watching, there was no way to avoid it. A hush fell over the room. Everyone strained to see what was so important about the crumpled paper in Amelia's trembling hands. Judge Grayson's voice cut through the silence, sharp and commanding. "Miss Carter." She flinched. "What's in that envelope?" Amelia's throat felt dry. The envelope contained something she had never planned to show. Not here. Not in a packed courtroom. And certainly not with Judge Grayson scrutinizing her every move. But Ethan, in his innocence, had brought it here. And now, she had no choice but to address it. She swallowed hard. "It's..." Her voice faltered. "It's nothing that concerns this case, Your Honor." Judge Grayson's eyes narrowed. "Miss Carter," he warned, "you're already walking a thin line. If you're withholding something pertinent to these proceedings, I assure you, it will not end well for you." She felt a small tug at her sleeve. "Ethan." His wide, innocent eyes looked up at her. "Show them, Amelia," he whispered. She felt her heart sink. The boy didn't understand. He didn't see the weight of what he was asking her to do. But she couldn't blame him. He was just trying to help. Amelia glanced at her client, Mr. Peterson. His expression was a mixture of confusion and fear. Her hands trembled as they moved to open the envelope. But before she could, "Your Honor." Mr. Hayes spoke again, his tone measured but firm. "I think we're losing focus here. Whatever Miss Carter has in that envelope is irrelevant to this case. The real issue remains, she is not a licensed attorney." The judge raised a hand, cutting him off. "I'll be the one to decide what's relevant here, Mr. Hayes." His sharp gaze turned back to Amelia. "Miss Carter." His voice was lower now. "A warning. I won't ask you again. Open the envelope." The weight of the moment pressed down on her. Her hands trembled as she slowly tore open the top of the envelope. She pulled out a single piece of folded paper. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew what it was. She had memorized every word. It was a letter. Handwritten. In her brother James's meticulous script. Amelia's vision blurred for a moment as she unfolded it. The words stared back at her. A plea. James's final message to her before he was taken to prison. "Amelia," the letter began. "I don't know how this is going to end. But if you're reading this, then I need you to know something. You are smarter than you think. Stronger than you believe. And if anyone can stand up for the people who need it most, it's you. The world isn't fair. But that doesn't mean we stop fighting. If you want justice, you have to take it. No matter how impossible it seems. No matter what happens to me, don't let them make you afraid. You were born to fight." Amelia's hands shook. The letter felt heavier than it should. She knew every word by heart, yet reading it now, here, in this moment, felt like opening an old wound. The courtroom was dead silent. "What is it, Miss Carter?" Judge Grayson's voice had softened. For the first time, he didn't sound dismissive. He sounded curious. Amelia took a deep breath. Then, she folded the letter and tucked it back into the envelope. "It's personal," she said, her voice firm. She lifted her gaze, locking eyes with the judge. "And it has nothing to do with this case." A long pause. For the first time since the trial began, Judge Grayson hesitated. The room felt charged. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Fine," he muttered. But then his gaze sharpened. "But understand this, Miss Carter, this is your last chance. Any further disruptions, and I'll have no choice but to remove you from this courtroom. Do I make myself clear?" Amelia nodded, relief flooding her veins. "Yes, Your Honor." She turned to Ethan, who still stood beside her, his big eyes watching her anxiously. She gave him a small smile and ruffled his hair. "Thank you," she whispered. "Go sit with Lily now, okay?" Ethan nodded and hurried to the back of the courtroom, where Lily, her best friend, sat waiting. As he climbed into the seat beside her, Amelia inhaled deeply and straightened her shoulders. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Amelia turned back to face the judge, her mind already racing through the next phase of her argument. But before she could speak, the doors to the courtroom burst open. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the tense, crowded room. This time, it wasn't a child. It wasn't a lawyer. It was a woman. Tall. Stern. Dressed in a sharp, dark blazer. Her hair was pulled back into a perfectly tight bun, not a single strand out of place. She carried herself with unshakable authority, her sharp eyes scanning the room like a predator searching for weakness. She strode forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Your Honor," she said, her voice slicing through the courtroom like a blade. "My name is Margaret Steele. I'm with the District Attorney's office, and I'm here to address a matter of great importance." Judge Grayson frowned, his irritation visible. "Miss Steele, this is highly irregular. What matter could possibly justify interrupting my courtroom?" The woman turned her gaze toward Amelia. "Cold. Unreadable. Dangerous. It concerns the unauthorized presence of this individual," she said, gesturing toward Amelia, "and the consequences of allowing her to continue." Chaos erupted. The room exploded into a wave of whispers, gasps, and hushed conversations. Amelia's stomach dropped. She knew, in that instant, Miss Steele wasn't here to support her. She wasn't here to acknowledge Amelia's efforts or to commend her on her knowledge of the law. She was here to destroy her. "Order." Judge Grayson's gavel slammed down, shaking the wooden podium. "Miss Steele," he said, his voice sharp, "you will explain yourself. Now." Margaret Steele nodded, her expression composed. "Of course, Your Honor. I have come to inform this court that if Miss Carter is allowed to proceed, it will constitute a serious violation of legal ethics." She turned, addressing the entire room with chilling confidence. "As a representative of the District Attorney's office, it is my duty to ensure that the integrity of this court is upheld. And allowing an unlicensed, unqualified individual to act as legal counsel undermines everything this institution stands for." Amelia's heart pounded. She had fought so hard to get here. She wasn't about to let them take this away from her. Not when so much was at stake. She stepped forward, her voice strong, despite the fear burning inside her. "Your Honor, I respectfully request the chance to prove myself. I may not have a law degree, but I have put in the work. I have studied the law. And I believe I am the best person to defend my client." Judge Grayson's eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. He glanced at Miss Steele. Then at Mr. Hayes. Then at the crowded courtroom. The tension in the room was suffocating. Everyone held their breath as they waited for his decision. Finally, he spoke. "I'll allow this hearing to continue." A sharp collective gasp ran through the crowd. But Judge Grayson continued, his tone firm. "Miss Carter, you are now on very thin ice. If you falter even once, if you make even the smallest mistake, I will shut this down. Do I make myself clear?" Amelia swallowed the lump in her throat. "Yes, Your Honor." Relief flooded her veins. But it didn't last. Because Margaret Steele wasn't finished. She stepped forward again, a smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. "In that case, Your Honor," she said smoothly, "I'd like to call my first witness." Amelia's blood ran cold. Witness? She hadn't been prepared for this. Her case was built on facts, evidence, and research, but an unexpected witness? That was a problem. She turned, watching as Miss Steele gestured toward the doors. The entire courtroom fell silent. A man stepped inside. And the moment Amelia saw who it was, her stomach twisted into knots. It was him. The businessman. The man who had accused her brother James. The man who had ruined his life. Victor Grant. Amelia's throat tightened. His presence wasn't just unexpected, it was a threat. He sauntered into the courtroom, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit. Every movement dripping with arrogance. He looked straight at Amelia. And smirked. That same smug expression that had haunted her since James's trial. Miss Steele turned to the judge, her tone confident. "Your Honor, this is Mr. Victor Grant. He is a key witness, and his testimony is crucial to establishing why this court cannot allow Miss Carter to continue her representation." Amelia's hands curled into fists. This was an ambush. Judge Grayson frowned. "Mr. Grant's presence is highly irregular," he said, his tone skeptical. "Explain, Miss Steele, why is this man's testimony relevant to these proceedings?" Miss Steele's smirk didn't waver. "With respect, Your Honor," she said smoothly, "Mr. Grant has valuable insight into Miss Carter's background and motivations. His testimony will reveal the underlying issues that make her unsuitable to act as legal counsel, even in an unconventional capacity." Amelia's palms grew sweaty. This wasn't about Mr. Peterson's case. This was about her. She turned slightly, glancing at her client. "Mr. Peterson." He looked at her, uncertainty flickering in his expression. She needed to act. Fast. She took a deep breath, forced herself to stay steady. "Your Honor," she said, stepping forward, "I object to this witness. His testimony has no bearing on the facts of this case." Judge Grayson raised a hand, silencing her. "Miss Carter," he said, "I'll decide what's relevant. Mr. Grant, take the stand." Victor Grant moved to the witness stand. That damn smirk never leaving his face. He was sworn in. Sat back. Got comfortable. Miss Steele stepped forward, her voice poised and professional. "Mr. Grant, can you describe your prior interactions with Miss Carter?" Victor Grant's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Of course," he said smoothly. "I first encountered Miss Carter during her brother's trial. He was convicted of assaulting me after a heated altercation." Amelia's blood boiled. Her nails dug into her palms. This wasn't just about keeping her from defending Mr. Peterson. This was about her brother. This was about revenge. And now, they weren't just trying to take away her case. They were trying to take away her credibility. But if they thought she would break, they were wrong. Amelia stood in the courtroom, her fists clenched as Victor Grant twisted the truth about her brother's case. He painted her past efforts to clear James's name as obsession, branding her unstable and unfit to defend anyone. Judge Grayson warned her to remain composed, but when Grant declared her too emotional to handle legal work, she fired back. "Too emotional or too determined to stop people like you from abusing the system?" The courtroom gasped. But before Grant could respond, a man burst through the doors. Disheveled and breathless, he held up a USB drive, his voice trembling. "I have proof. Proof that everything she's saying is true." Chaos erupted. The man, Henry Willis, revealed he had once worked for Grant and had evidence that the security footage from James's case had been suppressed, footage that could prove James was innocent. As the video played, the courtroom watched in stunned silence. It showed Grant initiating the fight, not James. The truth was undeniable. Grant's face paled. Judge Grayson turned to him, voice cold. "Care to explain this, Mr. Grant?" Grant stammered, but the damage was done. The judge ordered an investigation, and Grant's credibility collapsed. Miss Steele, relentless, attempted to shift the focus back to Amelia's client, Mr. Peterson. But with forged emails as their final piece of evidence, Amelia demanded a forensic review. Hours later, the results came back. The emails were fake. With no case left, Mr. Peterson was declared innocent. But the fight wasn't over. Amelia's apartment was ransacked. A single note was left behind. "Stay out of this, or you'll regret it." It was clear Grant wasn't done. With Willis's help, Amelia uncovered a larger conspiracy. Grant wasn't acting alone. His connections ran deep, tying powerful figures to bribes, fraud, and legal corruption. She turned to investigative journalist Sarah Green, who helped expose the truth. The next morning, the story went viral. The DOJ launched an investigation. Politicians scrambled. Executives resigned. But there was one problem: Grant had disappeared. With the help of Sarah and federal agent Ramirez, Amelia tracked him to a private estate. A raid was launched at dawn, and this time, Grant didn't escape. As he was dragged out in handcuffs, his eyes met Amelia's. "This isn't over," he hissed. But it was. 3 weeks later, Amelia stood in court again, this time for James's appeal. The evidence once hidden was now undeniable. The judge's decision came swiftly. The conviction of James Carter is hereby vacated. He is to be released immediately. Tears streamed down Amelia's face as she rushed to embrace her brother. "You did it," James whispered. "We did it," she corrected. Years later, Amelia stood in court again, this time as a licensed attorney, ready to defend her first official client. She looked at the judge, confident and unshaken. "Your Honor, I'm here to fight for justice. And I intend to deliver it." Her journey had come full circle. The girl who once stood in a courtroom, mocked and underestimated, had become exactly what the system feared: unstoppable.